So, what I also want you to do, in addition to hearing me talk about these things, looking over a PowerPoint and taking a look at the lecture to discuss the role of interest groups, is to see them in action. And so, we're using the case of the National Rifle Association, the NRA, and its ability to change significantly and to influence the discussion of gun control and gun rights in a way that is surprising to many people. I do want to introduce a caveat here. I recognize already from some of the ways in which people have been writing their discussion boards and based on the papers that they've written, that people have differing opinions about this, about whether or not there should be an individual bar that should go. And there are people in here who are gun owners and are proud of that. There are people who are gun owners and think there should be restrictions. There are individuals who think that we should ban guns. And so I recognize that this is an important controversial debate. And the role of using this is not to advocate a particular position. The videos that we're seeing are clearly advocating a particular position. They think that has too much authority, has too much power to change the debate and to go against the will of the majority and what is popular sovereignty. And I'm not going to ever ask you to agree with the positions that are put forward in these videos or disagree with them. I do not need either of those things. But instead, the specificity of it allows us to see a number of different things. Plus, it is an ongoing debate that matters. And if you take a course like this, you're going to have to think about some important issues that matter. And how do we use the tools that we've developed throughout this course to think about and to talk about and to discuss and to deliberate about important issues like gun control and gun rights, and how is that actually decided? And so I have two videos that I have found. One is from John Oliver last week tonight from October of 2017. It was right after the mass shooting at the nightclub in Orlando, Florida. It is one that at the time, it's this important information to recognize for those who aren't up on who's in control at different times, that at that point, the Republicans controlled the majority of both the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. And so it was Republicans who controlled the lawmaking ability of Congress. And so it's just important to know that as background information going into watching that video. The larger question that comes out of watching that video and thinking about that is, how does an interest group comprised of 5 million members, the NRA has about 5 million members, how are they able to block pretty much any gun control legislation that is supported by a majority, and often an overwhelming majority of American voters? Sometimes it is even a majority of Republicans. Sometimes it's a majority of gun owners who actually agree to things like background checks and other sort of restrictions that, once brought up in front of Congress, actually don't pass. And so what this leads to is obviously a clear trade-off between political liberty, the ability of the card-carrying members of the National Rifle Association, which also includes gun manufacturers and those who produce the bullets. How do those individuals and those corporations that benefit from a viewpoint that says that the Second Amendment is an individual right to bear arms and that any gun control legislation is a restriction of that important liberty? So it's talking about the idea of liberty. The way in which they can express their idea is through political liberty in the sense of freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom to petition. All of those things are freedom. But there's going against the will, often the overwhelming will of the majority. An overwhelming majority of Americans would like to have a large number of restrictions placed on gun ownership. Even a majority of Republicans, even a majority of gun owners agree to certain things like background checks and other sort of things that still haven't passed at the federal level. And so what we see illustrated in this debate is that important we've been talking about throughout this course. The other thing is you can see the techniques used by interest groups. The NRA has been successful in doing a number of different things. One is that when legislation is brought up, they're able to water it down and get the members of Congress to water it down, and then sometimes it still doesn't pass. But there are other techniques that they use that we don't necessarily think about. And it's one that links to the other video about the way in which trauma doctors are now entering the gun control debate, trying to change the debate, but instead to talk about it in terms of a public health problem. The number of people who are dying or being injured significantly because of gunshot wounds is significant. And so the ways in which the debate is framed will have an influence in terms of what is an appropriate response. And so what the NRA was successful in doing is to change it so that doctors aren't allowed to bring up the health effects of guns in a household. They furthermore are restrictions in terms of what the Centers for Disease Control can do in terms of investigating the causes of gun violence, the causes of accidental shootings and suicides and things like that. That it is restricted because the NRA was able to convince lawmakers to restrict the spending by disease control to limit the amount of investigation even into these issues. And so you see these techniques are ones of not simply passing legislation, but also influencing parts of the executive branch in terms of the Centers for Disease Control, in terms of what they can and can't do. You can see the role of combining the inside game and the outside game of interest group politics. You see that the NRA, which could arguably be considered a public interest, there are certainly ways in which gun rights are important to individuals, but the larger idea of gun rights is something that they believe should be society-wide. It's why we argued in the last slide that this distinction between private and public goods is sometimes hard to maintain in reality, because the NRA sort of is both of those things simultaneously. And the NRA uses both techniques of the inside game and the outside game. They have enough resources, particularly because they're corporate sponsorship for the NRA. And there are also a lot of individuals who do want the selective benefits of being a card-carrying member of the National Rifle Association, that the resources available to the NRA is significant. So they can hire lobbyists and try to do the inside game. But they can also try to do the outside game by just raising awareness and talking about this and mobilizing the grassroots. The other thing that we see is this argument that we saw from the framers of the U.S. Constitution, arguing that the fuel for interest groups is passion, and that the NRA certainly is passionate. The people who have joined the NRA are very passionate about their belief that the Second Amendment provides support for gun rights in American society. And that's a passion that they believe very strongly in that. And what John Oliver is suggesting to some extent is, yes, when you take a look at public opinion, you find that overwhelming number of Americans are in fact in favor of restrictions, some restrictions, they think, logical restrictions on access to guns, to gun control, things like that. But what is missing is the passion that the NRA members have. And so ways that those people who do believe that in fact there should be gun control should then start to have passion. And if we believe in that, then we need to start using some of the same techniques that the NRA is using. We need to be contacting our legislators and doing it consistently, doing it all the time. And in some ways, this video was from 2017, so they can't predict this, but in 2018, the 2018 election cycle, those interest groups who are in favor of gun control actually raised and spent more money than those who are in favor of gun rights. And so in some ways, they might have watched a show and decided to follow up on that. But the idea of matching passion with passion might be the only thing that can be done. And so that was one thing that he brings up. The other video about the trauma doctors entering the gun control debate is one that is talking about the ways in which the trauma doctors are trying to change the discussion, to move it to a public health issue, to think about this not in terms of any step that is going to restrict access to guns, is going to erode this important civil liberty of the right to bear arms, but instead it's built within a larger system of public health, that we need to think about this in terms of the aggregate good of the community, as they talked about in Federalist Number 10. And they're using their expertise of being trauma doctors to see the actual trauma that is these gunshot wounds, the number of people who will die, the number of people who are injured in ways that we cannot fix, despite the advanced technology that we have. And so they're trying to change the debate, and the ways in which they're not able to fight that debate because of the way in which the NRA was able to change funding for the CDC and what sort of research the Center for Disease Control is allowed to do about gun violence and ways to stop that. And so, again, the main point for you watching these videos is to think about the ways in which these interest groups work and to think about all the different aspects that the textbook talks about and that we've talked about in these lectures.